I was on a team building out a fairly large site with Elementor. And the problems that I had with Elementor when other people seemed to have no problem at all made me start to think about different use cases for the tool. And me using Elementor was a project requirement. I had no control over that. But the problems that I've heard people bring up with the block editor and full site editing and anything involving this new core experience in WordPress seems to fall into similar categories as the problems that I was having with Elementor, these quirks and bugs and limitations and confusion and so on. So when I'm building out new sites, I typically approach it from a core first, block first place. And the WordPress block editor and full site editing gets a lot of pushback from a lot of people in the developer community because people think it doesn't do the thing that they want it to, that their current page builder does better. And the main thing to know about Core is that it's not a page builder in the traditional sense. Full site editing lets you edit all the parts of your site. It does a lot of what these page builders do, but its whole thing is being a solid foundation that can be extended. That's the main difference between Core and these page builders. I've found that the page builders can be extended too sometimes, but only as explicitly defined by them. It relies on their platform providing everything within it. It relies on their support. Hopefully their community is helpful. It does all of this only to a certain extent. So some things that a page builder does isn't going to be done in the same way as a tool intended as the platform that's meant to cover most people's use case, that is intended to be extended for more advanced applications of the platform. So yes, there are things missing from the block editor. There are things that could be done better. It's not the holy grail of website platforms. I have a running list on Airtable of things I want or don't like or bugs I've encountered, but we've come so far from the old WordPress way in terms of being able to build great sites and being able to have a more robust editing experience. There's going to be a learning curve with any tool. That's just how it is. You'll have to spend a little bit of time learning how to get things to do what you want, what the limitations are, trying to see if there's another tool out there that lets you do more of what you want without a fight and that feels good to you. So as somebody who was going through this Elementor experience and having this not be my platform of choice, I wanted to kind of outline what these categories that I think a lot of these major issues fall into so that it's easier to figure out what parts are important to you and what parts you can compromise on. I think this will lend itself to having a much more productive conversation around these different page builders and platforms. I'm going to use my latest frustration-inducing Elementor experience to categorize these things because that's what's most fresh in my mind. That's what I've experienced from this. But everyone has different preferences and things that are intuitive to some and not for others. The best way to approach things is with an open mind, which is what I usually do when I take on existing sites. Not everyone wants or needs to completely rebuild a site just because it's not on an ideal platform. And that could be the eventual goal of a website, but maybe this is how it needs to be for now. And so this is how I had to go into this latest project being built with Elementor, a brand new site from scratch, custom site in Elementor with a custom theme, some traditional dev aspects, a little bit of a, SAS to CSS kind of situation. I had to adjust my thinking and see how I could best apply what I know. And boy, did I run into some frustrating situations. So with that, let's dive into some of these issue categories and how we can think about these things in a more organized and productive way. So let's start off with building in general. How is the experience when you're building the site? Not just the pages themselves, but just the whole builder experience. For instance, with every update, WordPress's drag and drop gets better and better. It used to kind of be pretty painful to get it to drop under the right thing. A lot of times that happens with like navigation menus, but especially with this latest WordPress update, that drag and drop really felt a lot better. It felt like a whole entire jump up to a new level. And Elementor's drag and drop was exactly the same as the last time I used it. I tried using that little outline that pops out, that sort of tells you what elements are on the page. So I tried using that and it would sometimes work. I tried doing it directly on the page where you can click on like a container or an element and drag it into another area of the page. And I honestly almost never got it to drop where I wanted, because certain things could only go into certain things. And if you did, I just didn't fully comprehend why. So anytime I couldn't get it to work in that little outline, which is where I felt most comfortable, sometimes I'd resort to adding like 2 empty containers to try to drop it between them. And then I'd delete those when I was done editing. They had to be empty, because if there was anything inside the container above it, it would end up getting dropped somewhere inside that random container. So again, the idea is that these issues people have should ideally get better over time. And so some of the criticism using the block editor was that drag and drop, you could never get it to where where you wanted it to go. Well, I had that same issue with Elementor, and actually now that with this, especially with this latest WordPress update, WordPress also, the core you can move things up and down without having to drag and drop. And I didn't really find that in Elementor necessarily. So one of the issues that I've seen people have with the block editor is that they toggle to a tab in a block. If you were then to click into another block, it doesn't keep that tab open that you were on. So if you were styling a background color and you clicked into something else, they wanted it to stay in that background color thing. Well, I can tell you, I was often disoriented with the Elementor implementation of this. It at first seemed inconsistent. I started to get the hang of it, but one person's preference of keep my tab open, it ends up being terrible user experience for another person. Again, it's just not so much that one does it better, it's more just that it's different, right? So the Elementor experience of what stays open when you click on stuff could be ideal for somebody, but for somebody else, it's not, like me. Like I said, I think I figured it out. It remembers where you were for each element that you clicked on. So you click on something, you do stuff, and then when you click on something else, it's going to reset to that first one, and then you do stuff. And then if you click back to that previous one, it'll remember where you were for that previous one. So it's like a third implementation of that, which again, like I said, it could be ideal, but I didn't get it. I constantly had to remind myself of where I was, and I would go to click on stuff. And so it's not consistent in my brain. Using the keyboard to edit, which I can do pretty easily for the most part in Block Editor, it's not foolproof and it's not 100%, but in Elementor it was pretty inconsistent, and so I ended up not being able to really like tab between certain things, because what would happen is when I deleted a value in something like a padding or a margin, random zeros would get added. It's almost like it needed a value there. It couldn't be empty, and instead of addressing that on save, it would just add the 0 as I was entering it, which isn't good for user experience or accessibility or anything like that. So even when I went, there's a way to like choose, are you doing it in pixels? Are you doing it in ems? Or are you doing it, you could like type in like a variable. So even when I went to like a variable field, a non-number field, it would still add that 0. And so then it would throw things off if I didn't notice, and it would break the page. And because the box was really small, the variable name would often be larger than the box that I was trying to type in. So I'd have to go to the beginning and the end of the text to make sure that there was no 0 there. So using the keyboard to edit and having to account for random zeros and stuff, it definitely wasn't ideal, and it would end up causing some things on the page to break once you saved it. It was a really frustrating experience trying to do anything regarding custom, margins, paddings, block spacing, anytime you had to enter in some values. Browser compatibility ended up being pretty terrible for me. Other people on the team didn't seem to have this issue. So I did some investigating in regards to the specific computers that I was using. As the site got bigger, if I added more than 3 or 4 containers on a page, the editor would slow to basically a stop. And what would happen is I wouldn't know that was happening. And so I would go to save it, and they have this progress bar at the top after you save. And so it would like hang at this one spot, and then I would know that everything I just did wasn't going to be saved. And for a while, for the first like 3 or 4 times I would do it, sometimes it would actually save it on the page. And so I'd be able to just refresh the page and go back to editing. But every time I saved, even if I didn't do anything more than just like edit a word, it would just hang. And there was no autosave to return to. And I realized that so I use a Mac Mini that's got the M1 chip, and I was using Firefox. And so I think there's some kind of bug with Firefox and M1 that it ends up using a ton of resources in certain cases. And I had yet to run up against this issue, and I only found out about it because of this site. I had yet to reach the maximum limit of my Firefox resources. So I tried Safari, thinking that maybe that's the computer's preferred browser and it would get stuck differently, but then still get stuck. And so luckily Chrome would only slow, and it would hang occasionally, but it would at least let me not have to like sit on my hands for 5 minutes while I find out whether the page would save or not. And it's frustrating, right? Because I need to save often to make sure things don't get lost because there's no autosave. But every time I save, I have to wait and interrupt the workflow. So my laptop is a MacBook Pro. It's got the i9 chip, and it didn't like editing the site on pretty much any browser. The fan would turn on, which on my laptop, the fan really only turns on if I like happen to forget to move the blanket that's on my lap, and so things get a little hot, or if I use iMovie actually, but it would turn on when I was editing this site. So I really had to stay at my desktop. I couldn't really travel anywhere and work on this site. And Chrome seemed to make it the least angry. And then when I was in Chrome, I have this add-on, this browser extension. But so what would happen was I would get, anytime the WYSIWYG editor would show up, it would end up adding this weird empty div with a class every time I saved it. And so I was like, what is happening now? So there'd be these empty divs everywhere. I initially just hid it with CSS because I was like, maybe this is an Elementor quirk, but kind of was like, that can't be possible because there are other people editing this site and they're not running into this issue. So I dove in a little deeper, and at least I could work on the site in the meantime. But I Googled around and I found a reference from the class to one of the accessibility plugins that I use. So I turned that off, which it's interesting because that plugin doesn't actually run until I start it. So I don't know what was happening. Other sites that I've worked on that use WYSIWYG editors, I've used all browsers. So I know that it's not the plugin's problem necessarily. So whatever Elementor was doing was like intercepting something, and I'm not sure what was happening. I disabled that, and then so now I'm finally able to edit this site regularly. And it's even more annoying because it only started showing this issue as a widespread issue about halfway into the project, because it started to happen when the pages got like, I guess, too long. We added a couple of plugins when I was first doing some initial research. It could have been the server that was throttling things because of how resource heavy everything was. It could have really been anything. I have yet to run into anything that was this frustrating on any of the sites that I've worked with so far. So that's the editing experience, creating sites. What are these quirks and bugs and things that are related to that. Next up, I think, is a really integral part to a lot of people's workflow is responsive controls. That's one of the major criticisms that a lot of people have about the block editor, full site editing, anything involving that is always, well, there's no way to edit things responsively. And my response to that is usually that it's got this sort of adaptive, intrinsic design feel to it so that people can put together these websites and not have to touch every little piece, right? It's to make things easier on a majority of people. And then people who are more advanced or who know what they're doing or, who want to fool around, and they can do things with CSS. They could do things with other tools that are on top of the block editor that provide those responsive controls. Sometimes it's really only 1 or 2 blocks that need to be adjusted, like the columns block, I find, is something that I have to edit a lot. And so there are these little issues that people have, like wanting to flip things around on mobile when it's got like a column, like reverse on mobile. That's a big request that I've seen people make, but I've also created a block style for it, and it took like 30 seconds for me to add it to the CSS, and it's done, right? So there are these ways where when you want to do something more advanced, the idea is that you can extend it, right? And it makes it easier for people to build these websites. And so you have these builders. So we have Elementor, right? And so we're having to edit things a lot more granularly in order to get it to the same base level that I've been able to achieve with the block editor. So for instance, when I went into responsive mode for a page on Elementor, and I went to edit the padding or the margin for smaller screens, it would have the previous values sort of grayed out, so almost like a placeholder, so you could see what the previous value was. But it would default to linking those values, even if they were all different on desktop, right? So it's on desktop, I've got, top, bottom, left, right padding, all different. Or maybe it's, horizontal and vertical or different. If I clicked the button to unlink them, it then reset them all to 0. And so I had to remember what they all were and enter them. And if I went in to edit it without clicking the unlink thing, it would then just default to all of them being linked. And so again, I'd have to remember what they were and re-enter them all. So this whole I can edit on all screen sizes ends up getting really muddled, and it complicates things because it's buggy. It ends up being harder to change something really small because you have to edit it on all screen sizes, and then you have to remember if you edited it. So then you have to go in and check, and it just starts to become this nightmare. It's almost better to just extend WordPress to provide settings for certain blocks that you can adjust on mobile, rather than creating this behemoth responsive system that ultimately just makes things more complicated. So that sort of brings us into this templating and, global style management category. The block editor doesn't have these like partially synced patterns yet. I don't know what it'll ultimately be called, but there is a plugin that you can install that lets you keep track of where synced blocks and patterns have been added. So eventually the idea is that you'd also then be able to keep track of where those partially synced patterns were. But Elementor didn't seem to keep track at all of where these templates were added. So we were taking a modular approach, right? We would create these sections that you can use, insert, and sort of like edit the category or edit the heading or edit an image. But if we found out that, maybe on tablet size, we had to adjust the padding by a little bit somewhere within it, unless we added a class to that was specific to that module, there's no way to impact all of those areas. And so my problem with this is that these platforms and builders are supposedly handling these things better than the block editor, when these all actually, Elementor and the block editor both have this problem of not being able to globally edit the style of something when you've added it to a page. So a lot of forethought had to be put into these, and how much do we add random classes and differentiate them between the different modules, and how do we target certain things within them? What if somebody was overriding something and so it got separated somehow, or again, just becomes this really sort of cumbersome thing that was supposed to make our lives easier because we're creating these modules. This modular aspect that we're going for, Elementor probably wasn't the best fit for it. Like I said, I didn't really have any sway over what platform we used, but it does mean that we ran into a lot of these issues where we'd have to go into every single page to edit some module that, maybe there was a layout change or maybe something else changed. The next issue is URLs and site migration. Elementor leaves URLs everywhere. Core will usually insert a full URL for things like links, but it will try to use IDs and dynamic data wherever possible. Elementor ended up breaking all of the images at one point, and it was either figure out a way to write a custom query to try to do it dynamically, or do this one fix that we came up with that we ended up finding for every single page. It really just totally messed with everything because it's referencing URLs rather than the image ID. Migration and version control was a nightmare. They had also WPML on top of that, which again, was not a choice. It just was what it was. And so having that on top of Elementor, it just kind of created this complicated mess on top of complication on top of complication. And so there was a lot of things that we ended up having to do manually, and then it sort of ended up making having staging sites not really work out in the traditional way. A lot of times you run into this with e-commerce sites, right? Where you can't necessarily just do something on staging and push it right up, right? And because of the way that everything's saved in the database, it sort of created just this complicated mess. So URL and site migration, if that's going to need to be a regular thing that you do, unless there's some other thing or secret or workaround or whatever, Elementor was not fun to migrate. Some additional quirks and bugs, maybe something that can't necessarily be categorized under something else. Like most of the things that I'm bringing up seem to be quirks or bugs or not priorities or whatever, but one of the things that I encountered was saved templates ended up getting added in a way that didn't let you drag it into other containers on the page. So maybe this would fall under like site editing or templating and global style management. Like this one might sort of fall into multiple categories rather than just the general quirks and bugs. But basically you would create this, module, right? And you would save it as a template. And then when you went to add it to another page, if you wanted to create this as sort of a thing that would sit inside of something else, you couldn't drag the whole thing into something else. It sort of made it this top level container that you couldn't change. And so you sort of had to build it inside of this disposable container that you could drag it from and then delete it, or you could actually duplicate it and then delete the original and drag it where you wanted. So it was just this like really weird bug that kind of we ended up having to go back and edit the previous modules that we had saved because we discovered this limitation from it. And so it sort of created this discrepancy between like modules we made in the beginning and modules we made at the end. So it's just these like little quirks and bugs that, depending on how large the site is that you're building, if you're just creating these templates as sort of full page templates, then you probably aren't going to run into this issue. But if you're trying to go for a more modular approach, then that's definitely a bug that I would be aware of. And then finally, we sort of have this extending and advanced features idea of the page builders, where one of the draws of Elementor and these page builders is supposed to be that you can do some of these more advanced type things easier, right? So like sliders and accordions and whatever else you needed to do, they should be accessible, which they're often not, and they should be easy to use and adjust, especially on the different screen sizes, right? The whole idea of this responsive being able to edit things on all the different screen sizes should be that you can edit these widgets on all the different screen sizes. But we ended up having to find a plugin that did these like different types of sliders. We ended up finding a plugin that edited a few different types of modules we needed. And it even only loaded it when you went in and added that module instead of adding, it was like a library of like a ton of different types of widgets. And so you had to go in and actually add it to your site. So that was nice. But there were then these weird quirks within each of those modules. And so getting it to fit this preset design wasn't ideal. We probably needed to look for that plugin first and then base designs off of what was offered. But adjusting things for mobile meant either duplicating things and then doing that trick of like, I'm going to hide this and show this and do that kind of thing, which you can do in the block editor with the block visibility plugin. There are ways to do that. So I kind of was just hoping / expecting some kind of more advanced thing, especially when they had this feature that was like remote control kind of thing. So we could create these areas and then we could sort of create the arrows or, the number of slides and these different sort of components to remotely sort of access this main area. And so all of that sounded really nice and it did sort of work for the most part, but doing anything that was different from what they provided ended up having to write like some custom JavaScript, and we already had to write some custom JavaScript to fix some of the bugs of that plugin. And so turning things into sliders on mobile or turning them from sliders to some other configuration on mobile using that plugin added in a ton of complexity and still didn't always do what we needed. And so I kind of was, I don't know if I could say surprised, but a little, I don't even know what the right word is. Not quite annoyed, just disappointed, I guess, that I couldn't do these more advanced things with this tool that supposedly made building sites easier. One thing I did like that is something to bring up in terms of extending and advanced features is I did like that Elementor allowed you to have these filter capabilities. I think it had it out of the box. We ended up using some more advanced parts of this using that plugin that we purchased and using some like widget remote control type things. But filtering is something that is much more involved in Core. It is not necessarily something that's out of the box. You can display things based on filtered options, right? So if I wanted to display posts from a certain category, I could do that, but I can't necessarily create a custom post type and have a way to like filter things out. So that was something that was really pleasant in Elementor. And so if you're doing something super basic and then want that filter capability and don't want to have to mess around with a bunch of plugins, that was a really cool use case for it. And so it made me, again, experience what a lot of other people are experiencing with the block editor, where you're like, oh my goodness, this is so easy in Elementor. Why can't we have this in the block editor? So it did make me sort of experience what a lot of people are experiencing with that. And so it made me want to really find a great plugin or potentially build a great plugin that fills in those gaps that I was able to do so easily in Elementor. Now, that really was the only thing that I found that from Elementor that I'd want to take with me into the block editor. And there are ways to filter. I've built, quite a few sites using a couple of different ways to filter depending on what the requirements are. But they tend to be a little bit more advanced. Where I have to sort of set it up for somebody and then they can sort of go in based on my instruction and edit it if necessary. So that would be something that would be really cool, where you could just sort of drag and drop in some filters and make it really nice and easy all within the block editor. So that's sort of something that I'm adding to my wish list on, Airtable. And that is my Elementor experience. I contemplated calling this Elementor Horrors. I think that's a little harsh. I think now that some time has passed between when I've completed that site and now, I no longer feel quite so strongly about the frustrations that I've outlined here. So instead, these are just, Elementor woes, ultimately categorizing the complaints with site editing tools so we can better understand what it is that's important to us for any given project, and then maybe hopefully pick the right tool for the job. It is possible, as a disclaimer, that some of the specifics that I've mentioned here could end up getting fixed or become outdated. That's always the risk of talking about these builders and WordPress as a whole. Things change, but the general principles are still going to apply. So let me know in the comments what kind of frustrations you have with different site building tools, which category is the most important to you, and if there are other categories you think could be added to this list.